Welcome to the Duckpin Podcast with your host, Brian Griffiths. And now, here's Brian.
As I tape this, it is Monday night, November the 2nd. This, of course, will air on Wednesday morning for the first time, Wednesday morning, November the 4th. By the time this airs, we may very well not know who has won the 2020 presidential election. God willing, we will. But you have to ask yourself, how did we get here? How did we get to this place in our country? How did we get to the point where the two major parties were offering us a retread who has been in Washington since 1972 on one hand, and a failed businessman who's done a disastrous job as president for the last 4 years on the other? How have we gotten to this point in our country where hatred of the other side politically is acceptable? How did we get to the point where protesters occupying large swaths of city blocks, burning them to the ground, instituting their own government in certain cities, how did we get to the point where that was acceptable? How did we get to the point where it was acceptable for 4,000 to 5,000 people, supporters of the incumbent president, to flood local highways in a strategic effort to disrupt traffic? How is that? How did we get there? How did we get to that point? How did we get to the point where it was acceptable to disinvite your neighbors, your family from Thanksgiving because they voted for a different candidate than you did? How is it acceptable? How did we get to the point where the Girl Scouts of the United States felt like they had to delete a congratulatory message for a United States Supreme Court justice because too many people complained about the politics of their congratulations? How did we get here? How did we get to the point where the left thinks it's appropriate to threaten violence against the public, against the government, because of a Supreme Court justice at all? How did we get to the point where it was acceptable to threaten violence because you don't like the outcome of an election? How is it acceptable to change the rules of the election, or at least attempt to change the rules of the election, days before the election? How did it become acceptable for the President of the United States to suggest that all the votes have to be counted by the close of polls on election day, in contradiction of the way we've run elections for decades, in contradiction of the Electoral College? How is any of this acceptable? How did we get here to this point? Partially, we got here because Washington became the center of everybody's life. Somewhere around 20, 25 years ago, people decided that Washington was the nexus of political life, that all decisions, all things should be focused on Washington. Not on local towns, not on city councils, county councils, boards of education, not even state government. But people found their lodestar being in Washington. It didn't matter which side of the aisle you were on. People mobilized to fight based on what was going on in Washington. MoveOn.org formed as an organization to try to get people to move away from talking about Bill Clinton's impeachment. And they yet still exist, focused on whatever happens in Washington on any particular day. The National Rifle Association stopped being about gun rights, stopped being about shooting sports, and almost became a de facto arm of the Republican Party, solely to maintain congressional access. We've lost sight of everything in this country. We've lost sight of what's important. It's not just because of politics in Washington. Our culture has a long way of focusing that as well. As soon as culture became dependent on what was popular, what was hip in New York and Los Angeles, it nationalized everything, and along with it, our politics. Tastemakers in New York and Los Angeles determine what's hip and what's cool and what's appropriate. Unfortunately, tastemaking, as it relates to politics, moved down to Washington. So everything is based on what's going on in D.C. You'd be surprised how many candidates I've talked to, people running for state delegate, state senator, county councilman. The question they get most on the campaign trail in the last couple of years was not about taxes, about schools, about the role of government. It's about what they thought of President Trump. As if their opinion on President Trump and anything that was going on in Washington and gave one inkling as to what they would do sitting on a county council or a board of education. I don't know who needs to hear this, but your opinion on President Trump doesn't really affect your vote on a state budget or a state tax issue or a bond issue or an education plan. I don't know who needs to hear this, but there are people that don't want to know what Washington is going to do for them, or in many instances to them, and want to know how you're going to help them in their backyard. They want to know how government can either help them or hinder them where it matters most, and that's not in Washington, that's in our communities. The level of government that most people touch, that most people have an interaction with, it's local government, particularly boards of education, but other things as well. Donald Trump doesn't pick up your trash. Nancy Pelosi doesn't plow the snow. And they have no inkling, they have no relationship to the people who do, other than both have taken an office to uphold and defend the Constitution of this United States. One could argue how effectively anybody's doing that these days. How did we move to a point in society where it was acceptable for the President of the United States to threaten to beat up his opponent, as Donald Trump did to Joe Biden a couple of days prior to the election? How did it become acceptable to exploit the addiction of a presidential candidate in order to score cheap political points on a story that is of questionable veracity? How did it become acceptable to make shock jockery, to make owning the other side a pinnacle of political discourse? How did we get here? What this country has become, what politics has become, is a dehumanizing blood sport, the rhetorical equivalent of the old gladiator games, where people just get thrown to the wolves, thrown to the lions, placed in hand-to-hand combat, and all for the entertainment of the masses. And don't think that so much of politics is not entertainment now. Governing is secondary to getting reelected. Governing is secondary to making a good impression on Fox News or MSNBC. Governing is secondary to building a campaign war chest or running for the next office. We have dehumanized our politics, breaking into warring tribes who don't care about the feelings, the emotions of people on the other side. One might argue that this actually all comes back to the de-churchification, if you will, of the country, the lack of religiosity in this country. You see, when people went to church, they understood that they are their brother's keeper, that the 10 Commandments were not just good ideas or suggestions from up on high. They're the law in the spiritual realm, in this world and beyond. Loving thy neighbor, it's not a post-it note during a group session. It's real. Love thy enemy. I'm not even sure some of these people know what love is. I'm not sure that some people in national politics have ever experienced the emotion of love based on the way they treat people. Certainly not love of their neighbors, certainly not love of their country. Politics has become what's in it for me. And I'm not just talking about the local elected officials and the elected officials at all. I'm talking about you, the individual person. The person who votes for a candidate based not on what they're going to do for the country, but what they can do for you, whether it's in tax cuts or government handouts or government contracts or zoning or whatever. Nobody thinks about the greater good in the sense that you and I know what the greater good is. Now, some people are going to misconstrue when I say the greater good, that that's some sort of statist issue. It's not. The idea is that when we vote for the person who most reflects our ideals, but also is the person who will do best by the people of our communities. Unfortunately, people don't care about that anymore. Now, look, I'm as guilty as anybody else. I came late to the religion game. I didn't get baptized till I was 33 years old when I became a Catholic. I get that. Heck, I'll admit I'm just as bad as anybody else. I am a sinner like you when it comes to how politics has evolved in this manner. There are simple rules in politics that they're boxes that should be pretty easy to check. Love thy neighbor. Love thy enemy. Tell the truth. How hard are any of these things? The president can't clear that bar. Probably many of your local state delegates, senators can't clear that bar. People are too busy trying to figure out how to get ahead than they are to do what's best for their country, for their state, and for their community. So, I guess the question is now, how do we fix it? Well, hopefully we can fix it. I am not a pessimist like some. I believe that America's greatest days are still ahead of us, that this is a bump in the road. We could go the other way too. Continued violence, continued division. But it starts at home with all of us. It starts with acknowledging that people on the other side aren't necessarily evil. It starts with acknowledging that you don't have to hate somebody whose ideas are different than yours. That one step, we all can do that. It's taken some time for me, I admit that. There are some people who drive me crazy on both sides of the aisle. But I don't hate them for it. I respect people who have different ideas, who have strong ideas, and who are honest about their ideas. And that's really the other thing that we need to restore in this country is integrity. Far too many people in politics, in business, in the media have no integrity to speak of. You may recall I wrote recently about Len Foxwell, who was the chief of staff, former chief of staff now, to the comptroller of Maryland, Peter Frencho, somebody who used his position to try to influence elections in favor of somebody with whom he was cheating on his wife. You can't really talk. There are so many different ways of violations of integrity there. You can't shake a stick at them. And that's the problem, is that there are many people who are like Len Foxwell who haven't gotten caught, who are continuing to abuse their position, abuse the trust of their partner. I absolutely pray that all of them, Mr. Foxwell included, that his family forgives him and that he lives a strong and healthy life with his family for the remainder of his days. But we need to make sure that we elect people of character and integrity to public office. And with the example that we have had from the White House for the last 4 years, it's hard to say we're getting a good example from Washington. I implore you, beg of you, please, do what you can to make this world a better place. Do what you can to make politics a better place by supporting people of integrity first and foremost, people who put their communities first, people who put their ideas first. Turn off Fox News. Turn off MSNBC. Turn off CNN. Turn off Red State. Turn off the Daily Kos. Read local news. Read local opinion. Watch your local news. Listen to local radio. Talk to your neighbors. You know how hard it is to have a conversation with a neighbor these days, even in our community. We try to reach out to our neighbors with limited amounts of success. Communities used to be about community. Now they're just collections of houses in a good school district. Be the change. We can save this. We can make America, our neighborhoods, better places to be, better places to live, to grow a better quality, a better class, if you will, of leaders for our country. And maybe we can stop this violence, and we can stop this hatred. We can stop this bastardization of the Constitution, this bastardization of the rule of law. We can put Humpty Dumpty back together, but it's going to take effort. Now, I'm not going to reach the entire country with this spiel, okay? But if one person tells one person and tells one person and shares their thoughts, maybe we can make a small part of the world just a little better. I think at this point, the best thing that we can do for our country, regardless of what the result has turned out to be, is to pray. To pray to Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception, the patroness of the United States, for her blessing and her protection. To pray to whatever God you believe in whatever way you believe, that he continue to bless this great nation, and to pray for leaders of integrity, of character, and of strength. Because friends, we can't go on like this much longer.